There is a room under Grand Central Terminal in New York, about 100 feet below the sidewalk, and hundreds of thousands of people walk over it every day without knowing it is there. It covers roughly 22,000 square feet. That is about the footprint of the main concourse above it. It was cut out of solid rock, and the rock face down there still carries the drill and blast marks from 1929. There is no address for it. The door is unmarked. It is not abandoned. Not sealed, not flooded, not a relic somebody forgot about. It is running right now, and it is one of the reasons the trains move. The railroad that built it ran 9 substations like this along its electrified lines. 8 of them, Mott Haven, Kingsbridge, Yonkers, Irvington, Ossining, Botanical Garden, Tuckahoe, White Plains, sat in the open beside the tracks, in ordinary buildings, because a shed full of machinery earns nothing, and land next to a railway is cheap. This is the one that got buried 100 feet into Manhattan bedrock. It went down there because the ground it had been standing on was worth more as a hotel. 2 things about this room. The secret room under Grand Central was printed in a magazine advertisement with a photograph of the sidewalk above it, and in 1988, one of the machines down there tore itself apart and threw hot metal across the room. Both of those come later. Stay with me for the first one. This is the story of the Park Avenue main line, the law that forced it to go electric, and the power station New York moved 7 city blocks underground without stopping a single train. Follow it with me from 42nd Street up to the Harlem River. To understand why anyone buried a power station under a train station, you have to start with the island. Manhattan is long, narrow, and made of hard rock. When the New York and Harlem Railroad picked its line in 1831, it picked 4th Avenue for the only reason that mattered then. 4th Avenue ran straight north, and the land was empty. The problem is what sits underneath it. Prospect Hill and Mount Pleasant are ridges of Manhattan schist running across the route, and the railroad had to cut through them rather than around them. A 596-foot tunnel was driven through Prospect Hill in 1837. The city's Landmarks Preservation Commission calls it the oldest railroad tunnel in the United States. By the 1870s, the city had grown around the line. What had been a country route was now a trench through a neighborhood, and people were dying at the crossings. A law in 1872 forced 4¼ miles of track underground between Grand Central and the Harlem River. The construction followed the rock. Where there was room, they built arched brick tunnels. Where the headway was too tight for an arch, they built beam tunnels, with the cross streets carried over on steel bridges. Where there was room for neither, they left it as open cut and covered the gaps with landscaped median. North of 98th Street, the ground falls away into the Harlem Flats, so the line came back up onto a stone viaduct 4,563 feet long. That is the geography that made the smoke lethal. A 4-track line running in a covered trench under a residential avenue, with steam locomotives at 45-second headways and ventilation limited to holes in the median. That is a chimney with signals in it. The terrain did not just shape the route, it trapped the exhaust. And the same rock explains the room. The schist that made the cut so expensive is also strong enough to hold a 22,000 square foot ceiling with nothing under it. By 1902, 44,000 people were coming into Grand Central Depot on a weekday, at a train every 45 seconds through the peak. On the 8th of January that year, 2 trains collided in the smoke inside the Park Avenue tunnel. 15 people died, by most contemporary counts. Some sources say 17. More than 30 were injured. 16 months later, it was illegal to run a steam locomotive on Park Avenue at all. So the railroad had to electrify. And here is where the second constraint takes over. Moving power over distance needs alternating current. Third rail traction motors need direct current. In 1907, there was no solid-state device that could turn one into the other. The only machine that could was the rotary converter, an alternating current motor, and a direct current generator, sharing one shaft and one set of windings, spinning continuously, with brushes riding on commutators and slip rings that wore down and needed cleaning. That machine dictated everything else. It had to be housed. It had to be manned. Staff started and stopped individual converters around the rush hours by hand, because running one when it was not needed simply wore it out. Behind it, you needed a battery room, because a machine that spins can stop. And you needed 9 of them strung along the line, because 600 volts of direct current will not travel far down a third rail. 2 generating stations, 11,000 volts of alternating current, and 9 manned conversion points. That entire architecture exists because of a limit in what a 1907 machine could do. The engineers were not making a strange choice. They were making the only choice their decade offered them. The corridor came first, and it was expensive. The 4th Avenue improvement ran from 1872 to 1875. The contract north of 48th Street went to Dillon, Clyde and Company on a winning bid of $6,395,000. The cost was split between the New York Central and the city, whose $3.2 million share was to be recouped from taxes on the development everyone assumed would follow. The whole improvement opened on the 20th of June, 1875. The Park Avenue improvement followed in the 1890s at about $2 million, including a new 4-track bridge over the Harlem River built by the King Bridge Company for around $500,000. Then the terminal. Reed and Stem worked with Warren and Wetmore under a contract signed in 1904. The chief engineer was William J. Wilgus, who had held the post since 1899. It was built between 1903 and 1913, while the old station kept operating, with no cancellations of revenue trains. About 3.2 million cubic yards of earth and rock came out. The cost is usually given as $80 million, though you will find $65 million and $35 million in respectable places, so treat the figure as a range. It opened on the 2nd of February 1913 at 1 minute past midnight, with 49 tracks at platforms, 32 upstairs, 17 down. 2 interlocking machines controlled the switches and signals between them, with 760 operating levers. The power came separately. Substation number 1 at 50th Street was finished in 1906, specifically to beat the steam deadline, and eventually held 7 rotary converters totaling 14,500 kilowatts. The service plant beside it followed in 1910, 10 boilers, 6,000 boiler horsepower. Substation number 1A, 4 more rotaries, arrived in 1913, and in 1918, because the 50th Street plant had already run out of capacity, the railroad excavated a second steam plant directly under the terminal. 4 floors, all underground, exhausting up a smokestack built through the corner of the Commodore Hotel next door. That excavation is the room. Here's the detail that tells you what this operation was actually like. The boiler room under the 1900 station had 9 feet of headroom, so the engineers installed 6 200-horsepower Bel-Paire boilers, locomotive boilers, the kind designed to sit inside a steam engine, laid out down a 300-foot room, because nothing else would fit. The switchboard for that plant was said to be built of Tennessee marble. No photograph of it is known to survive. The 50th Street plant existed partly because the buildings around Grand Central could not have basements. They were standing on top of a train yard. So one railroad boiler house heated 28 of them, at a daily average of 5 million pounds of steam. There was also a device down there, built by Westinghouse in 1913, that printed ticker tape whenever a train stalled, showing where it had stopped. It was obsolete by 1922. By 1930, the machinery under the terminal was lighting more than 100,000 electric lights, moving more than 650 trains a day, and running 325 elevators across 28 buildings. Not a power plant for a station, a power plant for a district. Real quick, if you're getting something out of this, the best thing you can do is watch it through or hit subscribe. That's it. Back to the line. Electrification did not just clean up the tunnel. It made the most valuable real estate decision in the city's history possible. Electric trains produce no smoke. Trains that produce no smoke can be roofed over. Space that has been roofed over can be sold. Wilgus's air rights plan was designed from the beginning so that selling the space above the yards would pay for a large part of the terminal below them. What it produced was Terminal City, from 42nd Street to 51st. between Madison and Lexington, the Chrysler Building, the Commodore Hotel in 1919, the Helmsley Building, the Margery, the Park Lane, and eventually the Waldorf Astoria itself. Land values along Park Avenue and through Terminal City more than tripled between 1904 and 1926. A street that had been a smoking trench became one of the most expensive addresses in the United States. It happened because a machine stopped producing smoke. The traffic followed the same curve. 22.4 million passengers through Grand Central in 1913, 37 million by 1920, 65 million in 1947, a number often described as the equivalent of 40% of the population of the United States. One aside before we go underground, because it involves the same piece of track. When the substation was moved in 1929, the crews used the upper-level train yard as their haul road. One of the tracks the flat cars ran on was track 61, the siding under what became the Waldorf Astoria. That track is famous for a different reason. It is widely associated with Franklin Roosevelt, who is said to have used the private siding and its oversized freight elevator, rated for 8,000 pounds, to reach the hotel without being seen in a wheelchair. Parked down there for decades has been a rail car with unusually wide, limousine-sized doors, described by Metro-North's longtime tour narrator as the car that carried Roosevelt's 1932 Pierce Arrow. I'd treat the Roosevelt detail as a strong tradition rather than a settled fact. What is not in dispute is the track and the elevator. The elevator still runs up into the hotel. The track is owned by Metro-North, not the Waldorf, and it is still blocked off. The point for our purposes is simpler. The same yard tracks that are famous for carrying a president's car spent most of 1929 carrying 850 tons of electrical machinery 7 blocks south. Now, how this system actually failed. Twice. In 2 completely different ways. The corridor's failure mode was optical, not mechanical. A coal-fired locomotive in a covered 4-track cut at 45-second headways fills the tunnel with a mixture of smoke and steam that scatters light. Signal lamps of that period were oil-lit and low intensity. The driver of train 118 on the 8th of January 1902 was not speeding blind down an empty tunnel. He was running into a wall of his own exhaust and the exhaust of everything ahead of him, toward a point where a Danbury commuter train was standing still, waiting its turn for a platform. His locomotive went into the back of it hard enough that the boiler passed through the last car. The scalding injuries came from ruptured boiler steam, not from fire. The jury acquitted him on exactly that ground. There was no way he could have seen the stop signal. The machine's failure mode is abrasion and flashover. A rotary converter has brushes riding on a commutator and on slip rings. Introduce grit, and you destroy the brushes on both the alternating and direct current sides, and score the commutator and the slip rings. If grit reaches the bearing caps, the machine is out of service until the parts are replaced and the oil reservoirs are flushed. Introduce something harder than sand, and you can get a flashover, a short circuit on the direct current side that produces a ring of fire across the commutator, destroys the coils, and throws molten lead solder around the room. That description comes from Robert Lobenstein, retired General Superintendent of Power Operations at New York City Transit, which ran the same class of machine under the subway. That is not hypothetical. In March 1988, one of the 5 traction rotaries under Grand Central failed catastrophically on its own. It threw hot metallic shrapnel across the substation and started small fires that the New York City Fire Department had to put out. Nobody was hurt. Nobody sabotaged that machine. By that point, only 2 or 3 of the 5 had been operational for years, which meant the survivors were being overloaded through every morning and evening peak. It was almost 60 years old, and it was doing the work of 5. The ledger for this corridor is uneven, and worth stating precisely. 15 dead and more than 30 injured in the Park Avenue Tunnel on the 8th of January, 1902, with the caveat that some accounts give 17. 7 dead in 12 days at the surface crossings north of Grand Central Depot in 1871, immediately after the depot opened. The New York Times called that confluence of tracks the city's most fearful death trap in 1872. And those deaths are what produced the 1872 law and the Fourth Avenue improvement in the first place. There had also been a collision in the same Park Avenue tunnel in 1891, less deadly, a warning the railroad did not act on. The driver of Train 118 was named Whisker, or Whisker. The spelling varies across the record. He was blamed publicly, indicted, and acquitted. And for the rest of it, I could not find a fatality figure for the 1913 terminal construction, or for the 1929 move, or for the 1988 failure beyond the statement that nobody was injured. So I am not going to give you one. The decision that produced this corridor is unusually well documented, and it moved fast. 8th of January, 1902, the crash. 15th of January, 1 week later, New York Central President William H. Newman announces that all of the railroad's suburban lines to Grand Central will be electrified and the approach put underground. December 1902, an agreement with the city puts the approach from 46th to 59th Street into an open cut. Late 1902, Wilgus appoints and chairs an electric traction commission, an independent panel of experts. March 1903, he puts the full proposal to the board. A two-level terminal, commuters below, intercity above. 7th of May, 1903, Chapter 425 of the Laws of 1903 is passed and takes effect the same day. The title is Bureaucratic, an act to provide for further regulation of the terminals and approaches of the New York and Harlem Railroad at and north of 42nd Street. Section 3 gives the railroad 30 days to file plans with the Board of Estimate. Section 4 does the real work. 5 years after those plans are approved, it becomes unlawful to operate steam locomotives on Park Avenue south of the Harlem River, except in emergency, at a penalty of $500 for every day or part of a day. Only the mayor of New York can certify that an emergency exists, and the mayor can revoke that certificate at will. The same section then explicitly authorizes electricity, compressed air, or any motive power that does not involve combustion in the motors themselves. Two things about that law. It is what's called an unconsolidated law, which makes it hard to find and easy to forget. Joseph Brennan of Columbia, who transcribed the text, could find no reference to it after the 1940s and concluded it was simply forgotten once the terminal was finished. And read that last clause again. No combustion in the motors themselves. If Chapter 425 is still in force, every diesel locomotive that enters the Park Avenue Tunnel today is a technical violation, at $500 a day, payable to a city that now subsidizes the railroad. There are 3 replacements in this story, and each one has something behind it that made the decision possible. Steam to electricity. The enabler was Frank Sprague's multiple unit control system, developed in 1897, which let one driver control motors distributed along an entire train. Without it, an electrified commuter operation at Grand Central's frequencies is not buildable. Tests in 1904 with Sprague General Electric cars proved the speeds were adequate. The first electric train ran into Grand Central on the 30th of September, 1906. The law supplied the deadline. Sprague supplied the possibility. Making steam to buying steam. The enabler was a commercial district heating utility large enough to supply a railway terminal, the New York Steam Corporation's boiler house at Kips Bay, distributed through tunnels already running under the lower train yard. The moment buying was cheaper than making. The 50th Street plant was worth more as land than as a plant. The block was sold for a new Waldorf Astoria, which opened there in 1931. But the substation was still needed, so they moved it. Everything went underground, because nothing could go over the street. Pieces were lowered through a hatchway in the floor of the old substation onto flat cars in the upper train yard, run south, then lowered again 50 feet through a second hatch into the new space, on temporary rope block and tackle at both ends. A new circuit breaker house went in at 49th Street so that 36 third rail feeder cables could be switched over one at a time while both substations stayed live. Then the battery, 160 cells, each 7 feet long and weighing 4,550 pounds, each one an open container of sulfuric acid, which is not something you are permitted to drive down Park Avenue. So every cell was jacked onto a trailer, towed by a battery-powered tractor, lowered 55 feet through a hatch onto a trucking platform beside the lower yard, and hauled underground to the terminal. 850 tons in total. It began in March 1929 and finished by Christmas, ahead of schedule, without interrupting service. The new substation opened on the 16th of February, 1930, with 10 rotary converters, 5 on the east side, supplying 16,500 kilowatts to the third rail, 5 on the west, supplying 8,000 for lighting and power. The third replacement came 60 years later. Power semiconductors finally reached traction scale ratings. A rotary converter needs staff, lubrication, brushes, a battery room, and a building. 3 solid-state rectifiers of 3,300 kilowatts each need a rack. Mercury arc and ignitron rectifiers had already displaced the rotaries across the subway system mid-century, and solid-state finished the job. A rectifier is also perfectly happy on ordinary 60-cycle mains, which is why the 25-cycle generating stations built for this corridor stopped being necessary as well. The 1988 explosion did not cause that changeover. It accelerated one that was already underway. Everything upstream of the room is gone or going. The 50th Street plant was demolished in 1929. The only surviving trace of it is the storage yard under the Waldorf. The Port Morris generating station in the Bronx has been demolished. The Glenwood station in Yonkers is still standing, derelict, decades into a long series of attempts to find a use for it. Substations number 1 and number 1A were dismantled, and their usable machinery is what went downstairs. Down in the room itself, the west side lost all its rotaries first, because by the late 1980s, there was no demand left for 250-volt direct current lighting at all. On the traction side, the fifth machine destroyed itself in March 1988. The last one was shut down in 1989, and 2 more were being taken apart at that moment. The 4 stations inside the tunnel, 59th Street, 72nd, 86th, and 110th, all closed between 1901 and 1906. The platforms are still down there, used for storage and emergency exits. None of them is longer than 172 feet, which is far too short for a modern train even if anyone wanted one to stop. The corridor itself has never been abandoned for a day. Now the thing I said I'd come back to. This room is famous for being secret. It is not marked on the building's plans. The door is unmarked. The guides call it the best-kept secret in New York. In the 1930s, General Electric ran a magazine advertisement about it. The ad called the new Grand Central Substation one of the most remarkable substations in existence. It printed a photograph of the room. It listed the equipment inside, and in case anyone was unclear on the location, it printed a street-level photograph of the Graybar building with a note that the substation lay 100 feet under that sidewalk. The New York Times had already covered the move. So had Scientific American, and the railroad's own staff magazine. You will also hear that Nazi saboteurs were sent to throw sand into those machines. 8 men did land by U-boat in June 1942. Operation Pistorius is documented down to the tribunal transcripts, and none of it names Grand Central. Nothing was ever declassified down there, because nothing was ever classified. Here is what's actually down there now. The room is intact and working, on solid-state rectifiers. At least one original 4,000 kilowatt rotary converter is still in place, not connected. Some accounts say 2. The overhead traveling crane built by the Whiting Corporation of Illinois is still on its rails, the same crane that installed the original equipment in 1929 and lifted replacement gear into place through the 1990s. The space directly above the substation, originally the steam meter room, holds the ventilating fans. The exhaust goes up the old boiler stack that runs through the corner of the Commodore Hotel. The air from 100 feet under Grand Central comes out through what is now the Grand Hyatt. The old coal bunker level, just below the street, holds the backup battery. Access is a single elevator and a staircase cut straight out of the bedrock. It is not open to the public. The depth is given as 100 feet in the contemporary sources, 105 to 109 in modern ones, 10 stories in some accounts, and 13 in others. Nobody agrees, which for a room almost nobody can enter is about what you would expect. For decades, it was described as the deepest basement in New York, deeper than the World Trade Center site or the Federal Reserve. That stopped being true on the 25th of January 2023, when Grand Central Madison opened with platforms about 140 feet down and a low point more than 175 feet below the street. The city dug straight past its own famous secret. Up above, 4 tracks run to a portal at 97th Street, 3 of them in the peak direction during rush hour, under 15 feet and 1 inch of clearance. The tunnel was rehabilitated between 1987 and 1992 at a final cost of $144 million. The viaduct in East Harlem is being replaced span by span in weekend closures, with prefabricated sections dropped in overnight, work that started in October 2023. Replacing the train shed under Park Avenue was estimated at $1.7 billion by 2024. Metro North carried about 67.8 million riders in 2024, roughly 230,000 on an average weekday in 2025, at on-time performance above 98%. All of them ride on current. That leaves a room they will never see. 2 honest things to finish on. The electrification worked, completely and permanently. Nobody has died of smoke blindness in the Park Avenue tunnel since. The corridor is 150 years old in its current alignment and has never closed. That is a rare thing to be able to say about American infrastructure. What it did not do is what the railroad expected. Grand Central was designed to handle up to 200 trains an hour and 100 million passengers a year. The peak was 65 million in 1947. Within 7 years of that peak, the New York Central was trying to sell the air rights over its own terminal to a developer who wanted an 80-story tower on top of it. Within 21 years, the railroad had merged into Penn Central, and Penn Central went bankrupt. The part the story usually skips is that the idea which paid for the terminal is the same idea that nearly destroyed it. Wilgus's insight was that the land above a railway is worth more than the railway. That built Terminal City. It also produced the 1954 tower proposals and the 1960 plan to put a 3-story bowling alley in the upper main concourse. The terminal survived because the city invented landmark protection around it in 1967, not because the economics ever came back. 850 tons, 7 city blocks, and 100 feet of Manhattan schist. Those rotary converters were not badly made. They were the best available answer to a real problem in 1907, turning alternating current into direct current at scale. And they did that job under Grand Central for nearly 60 years. What ended them was not a defect. It was a semiconductor, and the one that survives down there survives by accident, because the replacement equipment was smaller than the room, and there was nowhere convenient to take a 68-ton machine. That's the pattern. Infrastructure isn't replaced when it breaks. It's replaced when the land under it becomes worth more than the machine on it. Penn Station solved the same problem in the same decade with the same technology, and was demolished in 1963 while its rival was saved. The only real variable was timing. And the Glenwood Power Station in Yonkers, one of the 2 plants that fed this corridor, is still standing and still empty, because nobody had a hotel to put on the site. If you commute through Grand Central, tell me in the comments whether anyone who worked there ever pointed out which door it is, and whether the version you were told included the sand.